Hello and welcome to episode 52 of a Plain Account web series, where every week we are honored to have a commentator and a friend, theologian on the show to talk about and help us form our preaching this next week. This week we're going to be discussing Matthew 5, verses 13 through 20. And the commentator who provided that wonderful commentary this week is, again, Tyler Boyer. He was with us last week, and we're thankful to have him here again this week. Tyler, would you like to say hi and maybe tell us how your sermon went this last Sunday?
Yeah. It's good to be back, and I apologize. The delay in time is entirely my fault, so don't blame these guys. They are innocent. My sermon this week, was a little long. I told my congregation, trying to cram 8 sermons into an hour, into 30 minutes is kind of rough. So mine was a little long, and I constantly caught myself feeling like, I want to say a lot more, but don't have time. The struggle to be concise was very, very real this week. So I don't know how you guys felt, but that's where mine landed. It was
Yeah, I was the same way. Mine ran a little bit long. Kept looking at the watch and like, man.
Yep.
I told them each one of these deserves a sermon all in and of itself. So let it rest with you.
I was actually under my normal time.
But you're an overachiever, so you would expect nothing less.
I don't know how, but it was shorter than normal.
I'm Danny Quanstrom.
So,
well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to preaching from this text regarding salt and light. Continuing the Sermon on the Mount yet again this coming week. Let me get this text open and read for us today. We'll start at Matthew chapter 5, 13 through 20. I'm going to read from the NIV, and we can talk about how we might preach from this text. Matthew 5, 13 through 20. You are the salt and light. You are the salt of the earth, But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Let this be a word of the Lord.
Thanks be
to God.
So, Tyler, are we supposed to think that Jesus is still in the same position? He's still sitting there on the mount with his disciples. The crowds are still at the base of the mountain. Has the setting fluctuated at all from the 8 blessings we talked about last week to now?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. And I mean, there's nothing in the text that leads us anywhere in answering that. So I mean, anything we do there is a total guess. I was reading a older commentary by Fred Craddock on this, and he viewed the Sermon on the Mount as kind of pieced together. That he viewed it as Matthew, setting this on the Mount, setting up Jesus as the new Moses, and then piecing together teaching, and then it the Sermon on the Mount and think of it all in one block a lot of times.
Right.
But Craddock at least argued that it's kind of pieced together. And yet, even though it's pieced together, he saw in it certain themes and veins that, that bound it together and kept it consistent. And so, I mean, I think contextually coming off of last week, you have Jesus saying, okay, here's what you are. These groups, these people, these type of disciples are blessed. And, one connecting strand is, as we talk about salt and light, again, here's what you are. You are salt, you are light. And I also think it kind of makes sense if we've, another strand that I think connects these, whether the location is the same or not, is, if Matthew has positioned Jesus as the new Moses, right? As the one speaking in God's place from the mountaintop.
Right.
It makes perfect sense that within the next pericope, we move on to discussing the law and how Jesus is going to begin to talk about the law.
Right.
So, that's what we would expect to some degree if we're truly seeing Jesus as the new Moses. So,
Right.
yeah.
I really like that a lot. I think there was quite a bit of confusion in some of the other pastors that I spoke with about, well, who is this sermon directed to?
Right.
Do we think that it's directed to the disciples only, or also with the crowd? And I kind of just landed on the perception that it is anyone who wants to hear from the authority of the Lord, because Christ didn't tell the disciples or the crowd to leave. But they were all kind of there waiting for the authority of God to move and to be spoken to them, just like ancient Israel around Moses. They were in the desert wanting direction and guidance. So anyone who wants direction and guidance, come to the mountain, come to the authority of the Lord.
And I think you may have had the disciples as the immediate audience for a lot of this teaching. But I don't think the text allows us to ignore the crowd, to believe that, oh, well, this is some kind of secret knowledge, or this is the inside track. I don't think it lets us go there, because it begins with Jesus saw the crowds.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't think we should read too much into physical proximity here of the crowd. I think that, I agree. I think this is meant for anyone who wants to, to attend to the counsels of God and pay attention. So,
yeah. Well, my mind is already rushing to homiletical handles of bringing the kids up and letting them sing "This Little Light of Mine." But let's talk about.
Don't go there yet, Ben. Not yet.
Not jumping there. There's so much more to talk about before then. But let's talk about salt and light for a minute. What are we to do with these? At least for me, it's been sort of obscure. When I first read salt and light, I was not able to wrap my mind around these metaphors. It's taken a while for me to really become comfortable with them. So why light? What are we supposed to pull from this text regarding coming right after the blessings? How are we supposed to read this salt and light?
I think when you're dealing with salt and light, you're going to see salt and light act as kind of a build-up to how we treat the law and how we need to approach the law as well. Which that just had another thought that I may share later. But I think in terms of salt and light both, one of the things I think we have to recognize is the immense value. To some degree, we take these things for granted. We assume, all right, I have the Morton's iodized salt rotting in my cupboard, and I can flip a light switch and it's there anytime. I can stay up all night with lights on if I want. But Jesus' day, salt and light are valuable things. Mm-hmm. Valuable, and I think I mentioned in my commentary that so what was it, Solarium Argentum? That salt was part of a Roman soldier's salary. It was a special kind of ration given to Roman soldiers, from which we get our word salary.
Right.
So I think one thing that stands out to me, along with being blessed and saying to the disciples and the hearers, you are blessed. I think in saying that you are salt and you are light, Jesus is saying to his hearers, you are something valuable. You are something valuable like salt, something incredibly useful.
Right.
And and so I think there is it's interesting that the other kind of shift is with the blessings. There is this future sense of here's what will come next. With salt and light, in calling them something valuable and in a sense offering them what to me looks everything like a compliment, there is also a warning, right? We see warnings accompany here, okay? But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything but thrown out and trampled underfoot. So I think, you as disciples, you're salty, you're this valuable thing. I mean, just talking about salt, what did it do? It preserved food, right? It offered flavor.
Right.
It was given as salary. I mean, this is useful stuff. But what causes it to lose its flavor? I think I mentioned scientists reading this passage chafe because it's like, well, it can't lose its flavor. That's impossible. But the only way it loses flavor if it's not rightly applied, if it's diluted or diminished or kept to itself. If the salt's never tasted, there's going to be no flavor. If the salt is applied so sparsely that everything else overshadows it, it's going to miss it. So I think there's a movement here with both of these very complementary kinds of metaphors. You are salt, you are light. I think the text moves us to saying, all right, these are good, but you got to do something with it. You got to apply it. It can't just sit there.
Amen.
It can't be diminished or diluted, or it's going to lose its saltiness, its effect, and it's going to be good for nothing. So,
that is so powerful.
That is so powerful.
I think that's really the crux of the text for me, and it really connects well with Jesus' intention of not just telling the disciples about the Beatitudes, those 8 blessings, but letting them know that they are blessed. That is the way that God sees them. And so God sees them as this valuable salt and light in the world. And I think it drives us to the next part of this text where Jesus jumps right into talking about the law and the prophets. And what that is, the disciples are supposed to see their participation with the law and the prophets. I think in our culture, especially within the United States, we've become, we really bristle against anything that smacks of religion, right? I mean, religion has such a negative sense to us. And so we kind of like to ignore Jesus saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. What? The Pharisees are the bad guys. Like they are the enemies in the Bible. And Jesus calls us that our righteousness is supposed to exceed that. I know that I am saved. What else do you need? Like, I know that. Just know it. Just believe it. Rather than seeing that evidence, that saltiness, that light through our very being and our work in this world. So what are we supposed to do with that text that is almost countercultural in our in our Christian settings?
I think we have a tendency with this text to look at it a little bit anachronistically. As Jesus is speaking this is before Acts. This is before Paul. This is before the crucifixion. This is before, this is before dietary laws were changed in Acts. This is before, the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, where they're discussing what is the status of circumcision. This is before any of that. And so trying to read kind of post-Acts views of the law onto this text, it's going to mess with us. And I think it's going to mess with how we interpret and how we understand. So I think we need to take Jesus to some degree here we need to take him at his word. Okay, and as he's talking about the Pharisees, when we think about the Pharisees, thinking of them as enemy is a mistake. I think sometimes a better way to think of the Pharisees, they were popular. These were the people who were local, who you went to for moral advice, right? You could argue that a good analogy to the Pharisees would be the pastors. What did they do? They tell you, hey, I know. Everybody quick wash your hands of that, right?
Yeah, right.
We don't like sitting in that seat because we hear enemy when we hear Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I think that misses it. I think one of the things that's going on here, you have salt, you have light, that how do they become fully who they are? How do they live up to their highest potential? It's in their right use and application.
Mm-hmm.
And so what if we read that onto or into what comes next with the law? That Jesus is saying, hey, I haven't come to abolish the law. I haven't come to get rid of it, to diminish it, to destroy it. Or the prophets, but what does he say? I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill, or some translations use to accomplish. Mm. So just like salt and light, the law comes to life in the accomplishing of it, and the right use and application of it to a degree. And I think this is hinted at again when you come down to verse 19, therefore whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great. So again, the law is made complete in the doing. And I'm wondering if, as we talked about a little before, righteousness is being reshaped here.
Yeah.
Righteousness isn't what we guard ourselves from. It's not holiness that we hoard internally. It's not, it's not good feeling that we keep cloistered in our own little group. Righteousness becomes something that has to be enacted. It has to be enacted and taught, done
Right.
and taught, rather than kept and protected and hedged. And so, I think in talking to the Pharisees, the question is, all right, don't talk to me about righteousness in terms of what you haven't done. What have you done?
Right.
I think with the scribes, the, righteousness, well, I know the law. Great. Don't quote me chapter and verse. Show me how you've lived chapter and verse.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the metaphors of salt and light give us a real clue as to how to treat law and what Jesus is going for with the law. Stepping off my soapbox now and my pontificate.
Oh, that was.
I'll let you guys talk.
Danny, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, no, I don't know. I think one of the things we've got to acknowledge, which we've intimated, is that there is a certain there's a certain amount of fear with the Pharisees. Whenever the Pharisees show up, the people in our pews, they're going to be like, oh, the Pharisees, everybody hates the Pharisees, they're terrible people, obviously you don't want to be like the Pharisees. That's just the natural inclination of our congregations, and so I think it'd be kind of fun to say how do we have righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have more than that.
Yeah.
Which I think that's a really intimidating thing.
Absolutely.
And I think it's really challenging.
Well, because if we look at the Pharisees' life, they were vigilant attenders at synagogue. They tithed regularly.
Right.
They were an integral part to the religious system in their day, and so their failure, though, was, as Tyler just mentioned, that it was the internal knowledge and the holding of this law.
Right.
That it's what they should not do rather than what they are living out. And I think a good place for our congregations might be, as whenever the Pharisees show up and we say, oh, we're not supposed to be like them. We're doing exactly what the Pharisee did to the tax collector.
Right.
Lord, I'm not like that person. It's like,
right.
So now who's the Pharisee? Like,
Right.
And I think calling that out and making that, aware is a good first step to saying, well, instead of looking at how the Pharisees are not righteous, let's see how they are. Where do they measure up in righteousness, according to what Jesus is talking about?
I think. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was just going to say, I can hear some people listening to this podcast now saying, so what are you guys saying, that being educated is wrong? That having a theological degree is inappropriate or not valuable? That it's only about doing and not about knowing? I can hear some of those voices saying, you have to know in order to do. And I think my response to that anticipated critique is, well, Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus is not saying book learning is bad. He came to say, what he's saying here is that I came to fulfill the law. Yeah. And I think one of the things we have apparently these two pericopes, 13 to 16 and 17 to 20. But I would contend that the NRSV puts a title in between them. I think it's inappropriate, because I think these Pharisees are the salt that's lost its saltiness. Mm-hmm. They are the light that's been hidden under a bushel. And I think what Jesus is saying is that you don't understand the law if you're not keeping it, if you're not living it, if you're not caring for others. And so I think I would want to say appropriate theological education drives us then to do. Mm-hmm. If we do not surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees, then maybe we haven't been learning the proper theology.
And I think one of the questions that emerges here is, what does it take to teach? Because again, part of what Jesus affirms is the ability to teach others to do the same, to accomplish the law rightly. Theirs is the kingdom. That takes knowing what to do, doing it, and then teaching out of that overflow of wisdom that comes from both.
Right.
I don't think that Jesus is saying, hey, yeah, be stupid. I don't get that that's where he's going here. I think one of the ways that lets us relate to the Pharisees, I think one of the things that both as pastors, and I would argue even as lay people, what do we tend to do with things that are valuable? Something as valuable as salt, what do? You protect, right? What do you do with light? Something that's valuable, with fire. Well, you protect it, you guard it, you make sure you tend it, right? What do you do with the law? I think the issue with scribes and Pharisees is they spend a lot of time protecting it and tending it and guarding it from ever being sometimes even practiced or thought about wrong. But there wasn't a whole lot of enacting sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the questions that emerges for me is, are there places where, as we attend to the laws, we attend to, whether it's Old Testament law or the law of love in Christ, as we attend to the word, are there moments where we're far too busy protecting it because we do believe it's valuable? Are there moments where we don't want to risk expending it, or possibly misapplying it, or possibly doing a little bit wrong, or doing it a little bit wrong? I think protection is a place where our protectiveness of the word, rather than our enacting the word, might be a way to kind of get a handle on how to find some common ground with Pharisees.
Sure. And I think keeping this sermon in context with the way Jesus lived his life is always a good point of reference, that Jesus lived this out among the disciples, teaching them and living it out as well. His teaching was not just a a dialogue, right? Just words. He lived this out, healing the sick, bringing liberation to those in bondage, and we see that as his role as teacher among the disciples, living that out in his ministry. And he didn't hoard it either. It was always given. He's sending his disciples. He was not hoarding the power of God to himself, but always going forward and crossing boundaries where the Pharisees may had placed them before. Well, right. So moving to some homiletical handles, what are some good ways to maybe make this passage accessible to our congregation?
I think, one thing I think of that, might be kind of gimmicky, but what happens if we preach in the dark? What happens if we preach in the dark? Okay, what's missing here?
Yeah.
We have lights in here, right? We've seen them before. We've had them turned on, but what's missing? Or if the only light we use is like our cell phone on our notes, and say, well, I'm the only one who needs to see this, right? And I'm just going to tell you guys about it.
Well, I think that might be pretty normal. I mean, it depends on your style of worship. That might be pretty normal.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought about that might be a little goofy. Have you guys ever eaten an unsalted saltine?
Yes, they're terrible.
I know. I mean, they're bland. And when you eat a saltine, what do you expect? You expect this dry, salty thing. And then all of a sudden you eat an unsalted one and it's just dry and gross, So what happens if we hand one out and say, all right, everybody eat this? Oh, wait, somebody forgot to bring the flavor. What's it look like when, as disciples of Jesus who are to live out the good news, what happens when we forget to bring the flavor? Right. And fail to be what we are and to be what God has said we are. When it's diluted, diminished, or missing. I don't know. Those are a couple handles. I don't know if those are good or not.
I feel like there are a plethora of handles we could make here. Like this one is just rich with metaphor, which I think it's not always the case. I don't know. I think you could think of what are our valuable things today. And I don't know. I think of if I were to do a kid's sermon, passing out this unsalted saltines would be. I accidentally bought those for my wife when she was sick one time, and she was like, "What are these?" That was a big mistake.
Punishment, honey. Yeah,
I know. And so you can hand those out to the kids or to the whole church. But something if you do a kid's sermon is like if you purchase a brand new baseball glove and never use it, and what's the point? Anytime you do go to use it, it's going to be terrible because in order for it to be useful, it has to be used.
Yeah.
If it's not broken in, if the leather doesn't become soft, then you can't use it well. Yeah. Using an unbroken in baseball glove is terrible.
Yeah.
Or I think of, for our adults, like something valuable. How about vehicles? People spend a pretty penny on their cars or their trucks or whatever it is. Like even the cheapest vehicle still costs a significant amount of money. And what's the point of purchasing a vehicle?
Yeah.
To get you from point A to point B. Right. It'd be like buying a really nice truck and then using the bus. That's like, what? Why did you buy the truck? So it looks pretty in your garage? What's the point of this? Is this a status symbol? And that, I think there is some import there on the Pharisees as well. Is this being used as a status symbol? I also think of, when we're talking about light, at the end of the day, when I'm going to bed, I have to read. If it's on my phone or a book, I have to read in order to shut my brain down. And so oftentimes I'll use a book light or I'll use my phone's flashlight to illuminate a book. And in the darkness, my phone's flashlight is really bright. And my wife can't handle it. She hates it when I read. And so sometimes I'll have to take my covers and place them over my head with my flashlight so I can read under the covers so that I don't illuminate the bedroom. And that's taking a light and putting it under a bushel. That's putting it under the covers. I'm covering it up on purpose. And Jesus is saying that covering your light is a misapplication of light. You're using it incorrectly. But what happens when you are used to the darkness, or when you want the darkness, like my wife when she's going to sleep, is that light is an interruption. That light is unsettling. And it interrupts the darkness. And it doesn't allow the darkness to keep its darkness.
Yeah, and what happens, I mean, another kind of handle might be, what happens if we announce to our churches, hey, our church board, our church leadership has decided that we are no longer going to pay the bills of the church, and everything that we're currently spending money on the church stops right now because we value your money so much that you give. We're going to keep it safe. We're going to tuck it away. We're going to let it multiply, and in the meantime, everything we've been doing is going to come to a halt. Mm-hmm. So, we're going to keep taking the offering, right? But we're just going to store up and store up and store up. And so children's ministries, youth ministry, your budget, done.
Yeah.
We're just going to guard that for you. We're going to keep it safe because we know better what to do with it than you guys do. And we don't want it to inadvertently be misapplied or spent on, too much junk from Oriental Trading Company. So, your money's too valuable to squander. I think that would communicate some sense of, hey, protecting what is valuable is one thing, but we have to use it. It has to be applied, or it's missing the point.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good.
Warn your youth pastor first.
Yeah. I thought, during the saltine metaphor, those with those unsalted communion wafers need to be careful in that one. As soon as they go to take communion, they're like, "Oh, what does this mean?"
Or you could spike the cup with just super salty wine or juice. That'd be fun.
Mm.
See how many people
use the Welch's from the back of the church fridge.
Oh, there
it's
you
been
go.
there for a long time, and yeah.
Oh, well, now we're verging on heresy, so we repent and move forward. I love those, those of us who have a good children's group, bringing the children forward and having them sing "This Little Light of Mine." Not only would it be a great way to involve the kids, but it's also showing that we're utilizing the gifts that God gives us. We're not letting the kids just sit there, but we are bringing them up and letting them shine in their own light, and having their talents and gifts brought forward as a means of grace to the rest of us. I love the idea of preaching in the dark. Whether the lights go out before the sermon, or even like worshiping in the dark, people are like, "What is going on?" So, you can literally use what you have now to make that message before it's even preached. So that's a powerful image. Well,
I think one more thing that I want to reflect on is I think there's a pedagogical implication here that I think we often think that we do by learning. You get the right information, and then that translates into a changed life, which I think is really wrong or incomplete. And this is building off of a lot of what Jamie Smith has written in, talking in his Desiring the Kingdom and these cultural liturgies. The things that we do, they end up shaping us. So it's not just you learn to do, but I think it also is you do to learn.
Yeah.
And I think you learn the law by doing the law. By practicing Sabbath, you learn about Sabbath. And oftentimes, and I learned about healthy eating, not that I do it, but I learned about it, and I learned about exercise, not by reading books, but by going to the gym.
Yeah.
In my doing, when I was lifting, I was like, no, that's not right. I feel like that's incorrect. Let me figure out what's going on with this. And the doing pushed me to learn.
Yeah.
And then the learning also allowed me to do better. And so there's this marriage.
Yeah, and I think that approach, doing to learn, is far more consistent with, first century culture of Jesus, where, what do kids who go into their dad's trade do? Well, they learn by doing, by
Right.
apprenticing. And I think that's a great shift to make in our thinking.
Well, it also fits our Wesleyan heritage, right? I mean, Wesley's classes, that was his genius, and they learned by doing, not by, they didn't have degrees. What was radical about Wesley was that everybody could participate in the classes.
Yeah.
That's so good. I think one of the things that's been so powerful for me as I've been listening to us talk and reflecting on the text is something I mentioned before, is that, when salt and light are used, I think it beckons back to our incompleteness without Jesus, our utter dependence on Christ to be salt and light. Because when salt and light are used, I think one of the tendencies why we hoard things is because the saltiness stings our wounds, shows us where we are weak. The light shows us where the things that we want to keep hidden. So when we hoard salt and light, it keeps us from acknowledging our own inadequacies to allow the Holy Spirit to be the one that fills and moves and drives us to be that seasoning and that light that we need to have in this world.
Right.
And so that boldness to be salt and light is also a humility in acknowledging that we are incomplete on our own. And it beckons back to the fact that Christ is our teacher. To learn from him is to be the salt we need to be. To enact and to model our lives after Jesus is to be the light that we need to be for the world. And sometimes that hurts. But at the end of the day, after the salt has been there for a while and after the light has shined forth, it is through the power of the Holy Spirit that we're able to be redeemed and move forward in continuing our sanctification. One of the beautiful things that came out of the sermon in my congregation on Sunday that I did not expect was when Paul in the epistle text said, we are those of us who are being saved. Where the saving grace of God is a continuing work. It's not,
right,
I'm done, I'm saved, check that off the list and move forward. But we are continuing to be saved. And that's what the salt and light does in the world, is that it's continuing to be used. We learn and we do, and we do and we learn. It's a continuing work of sanctification. And that lives right into our Wesleyan heritage as well.
Yeah.
Or are there any final words you'd like to give to this text, those who are listening today?
I don't know. Part of me feels like this stuff is just so earthy. Saying salt of the earth. These are just basic, kind of fundamental, rock bottom kind of things, right?
Elemental,
light,
right?
Law, how do we do this? And not getting too far away from the earthiness of it and from the simplicity of what this is saying strikes me for some reason. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's one of the things that I kind of land on. These are metaphors you can get a hold of. Definitely get a hold of these. So I don't know.
I would just say have fun. This is you got some prime opportunities this Sunday that you don't have to force anything. Have fun with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe one thing that might help in this text is, okay, if we're arguing that to be faithful to this text, we need to do the law. What does that look like for us now?
Mm.
Can we come with an example? from beyond the text, can we maybe look forward into the sermon a little bit and see, okay, so what does it look like to live the law this way?
Right.
As Jesus continues to teach. I don't think an example would go awry, because just saying, okay, live the law, great. Which one? How?
Right.
What does that look like? And that's where I think if we can go to examples that are as simple and as poignant as salt and light kind of things, that are able to be grasped and gotten easily, I think that'll help us a lot.
Yeah. Wow.
I think of number 6. This is like if you're thinking about the law, this is what identified Israel, right? Number 6, 24, 25, 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious. That's an important benediction, but I think of, no, it wasn't Numbers 6. It was Deuteronomy 6. Listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, strength, and your neighbor as yourself. This is the law that Christ says to do, not just to know.
Yeah, and even with the Shema, the Shema there, what precedes our loving and our doing? It is our hearing together. And, hearing together God alone, God undiminished, God unmixed, God, I don't know. Again, the two go hand in hand.
Right.
There is this hearing and teaching, and then this doing, and it's this beautiful cycle if we get a hold of it.
So we as preachers must do our best not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
Accomplish it. Yeah.
In our preaching and in our ministry. Well, thank you so much for being our guest yet again this week, Tyler. So appreciate this conversation. It really helped my preaching last Sunday, and as I'm sure it will again this week.
Yeah.
And we pray that is the same for all who have listened into this podcast. As we have mentioned before, we want to give a shout out to our sponsor, JPixel, for their continued work with us in overhauling our website. If you would go and check it out and subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of those things. And we want to encourage you to preach boldly this week, be the salt and light in your communities, and encourage your congregations to do the same. Peace be with you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and my apologies for being the cause of the late start. So.
Oh, no apologies necessary. All right. Well, have a good week.
Thanks.
See ya.